Dear Foreign Minister Steinmeier, dear Mrs. Mogherini, thank you very much for your introductions, which I will not summarize once more. So I don't want to sum it up once more, but I do. So I do want to introduce two analysts. First of all, Jane Harman, Director, President, and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington. Mrs. Harman, up until 2011, she was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, and I think most of us will know her as a permanent guest of the Munich Security Conference as a face for the transatlantic relations. Welcome, a warm welcome to you, Jane, in Berlin. I would also like to welcome Jean-Marie Guéhenno. Mr. Guéhenno, since summer, has been president and CEO of the International Crisis Group, and from 2000 to 2008 he was Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, responsible for peacekeeping missions. Mr. Guéhenno, welcome to you as well. The discussion is facilitated by Christiane Meier. She's a correspondent of the ARD morning magazine in Berlin. Mrs. Meier, welcome to you, and over to you. So, thank you very much for the opportunity that I can come from the general to the concrete terms, because we've just heard from the Foreign Minister and the High Representative. I would like to start with you, Mrs. Harman. You just heard that you visited the Munich Security Conference several times, and you see how German foreign policy is developing. So I would like to ask you the question, do you have the impression, and I'll just say it as a journalist, that the division of labor, like the Germans live and think and the Americans shoot, is that something that works, or shall we change that?
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm honored that Herr Steinmeier and others would think that I could be the transatlantic face at this conference. I'm very honored. Let me make some more general comments, and I will answer your question, because I think much that was said in the opening comments and much that is in this poll illustrates maybe some differences between America and Europe, and particularly Germany. I think if this excellent poll that is, I hope everyone has seen, were taken in America, the results would be different. I don't think in America there is a significant interest in foreign policy at any age group. This poll shows that younger people in Germany have great interest in foreign policy. I think in America they don't. And I think this is explained by several things, one of which is our distance from some of the wars in our past. With the exception of 9/11, America feels, and Pearl Harbor, very distant from wars. I think also a difference, and I'm not sure this is true, but I'm guessing it is true, is that the devastation of war in this country in particular, and the celebration you just had to reunite Germany, is something that is a real living memory for people here, and we have nothing comparable to that. So I think the perceptions are different, and I think that there is war fatigue in America about these very long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that most Americans perceive have not gone well. So there is that background. And because there are different perceptions, I think our leaders lead differently. And I was at Munich, some of you were there, this February when Herr Steinmeier and Minister van der Leyden and Mr. Hauk talked about Germany stepping up to a bigger role. I'm aware that Chancellor Merkel will be at Munich this year, and also that Germany will become the chair of the OSCE, which are more opportunities for Germany to step up. The perception is that Germany is doing that, will do it, should do it, at least that's my perception. And the perception is that the U.S. is stepping back. I'm hopeful, as an American, that the perception of the U.S. will change and that we, too, will step up as a partner of Germany and as a partner of the European Union, which is now so ably represented, I think, by Federica Mogherini, who has a very strategic view of the future. So does German think and the U.S. just punch? I hope not. I mean, I hope we also think. I'm glad that you think. But I think that you, as one American very invested in the transatlantic relationship, I am impressed by what your leadership is doing now and how this new unity and effort to manage complexity, which was just described, is taking hold in Europe.
Herr Steinmeier, Sie haben empört mit dem Kopf geschüttelt.
So, Mr. Steinmeier, you shook your head emphatically. Was it such a wrong assessment? Mrs. Meier, with your opening question, you just gave a wonderful example of how we in foreign policy, also German foreign policy, will not make any progress because this type of black and white, on the one hand, there are those who take over responsibility and those who were prepared to act. And on the other hand, you've got the timid Europeans. No, this is wrong. This is a wrong picture of our cooperation, which we have at an international level, which I can only say I'm sorry to hear. So I'm not going to comment on that in detail, but I would just wish for you to be there. When we discussed 4.5 hours with John Kerry the other day at the Tegernsee Lake, and we just went through our different views of the conflicts, the conflict in the Ukraine, and how the future relationship with Russia is going to be, and how do we have to act together in the Middle East. And you will see that in contrast to the claim of your initial question, the commonalities, the common ground is much greater than what separates us. And also the readiness to address the complexity of the crisis situation of which I talked at the beginning. So in other words, what I want to say, also America doesn't believe that in the Middle East, for instance, we are in a situation in which the extremely complex conflict with ISIS can only be solved militarily. On the contrary, I think we are closer than we might have been in earlier conflicts, where we also say this is a conflict that we cannot do without military means. But it's not only the military solution. So the difficulty we have, and that's the challenge for foreign policy, for German and European foreign policy, as well as American foreign policy, is to find the degree, how much investment do I need militarily, and how much readiness do I have to review former positions and find a way back in a political solutions. This is not simple. We all know that. However, one of the reasons, and many ambassadors are here, also from the Middle East. So one of the reasons why we had the Syria conference in Berlin was probably to talk about the humanitarian situation of the refugees in the neighboring countries of Syria. Secondly, to seek ways and possibilities of how the neighboring countries who are accepting most refugees, like Lebanon and the Jordan, how we can help to stabilize these countries. And the third aspect, and that's why we actually invited Stefan Ministura to Berlin, was to talk with a new representative of the United Nations to how, in a totally difficult situation where we don't have a really military way out, but to find a way back to small political steps and solutions where no one knows today whether they're going to be successful or not. But I believe now what it depends on is to find the courage to think both the necessity of military action, but also the readiness to adopt political solutions going forward. And who doesn't have that courage, those will not be successful in foreign policy and will not make a contribution to resolving such conflicts. Maybe only after years, but they will be resolved. Mr. Steinmeier, you say it's courageous also to review foreign policy and open up also to the comments of experts, but also to the normal people. The Körber Foundation did a survey, and 60% of the Germans said that they shouldn't involve, and 82% that there shouldn't be any military involvement. So you're on the right side there. Mr. Guéhenno, from your point of view, you work for crisis avoidance, that before the crisis evolves, there should be an analysis. When you see the German foreign policy, so again, I'm provocative. Is it vain or very courageous to do this, or is it self-confident?
Important to have that kind of debate in Germany, because a foreign policy has to be supported by public debate in a democracy. It cannot be a technical affair, especially in this world where there are risks involved. And so I think this debate really starts an important discussion. You discuss Syria. It's clear that with Syria, we have had excessive expectation. We did not have the right analysis of what the situation was on the ground. There was an assumption that there would be a quick departure of President Assad. That hasn't happened. And so having an informed discussion, having realistic options on how to move from the stalemate that we are in, but which is not perceived as a stalemate, where the parties still think that they can win, and that means more people being killed every week. Moving from that perception, from that stalemate to the real perception of the stalemate. That's what we need to do. That kind of discussion helps that, because it helps us move toward practical policies. Minister Steinmeier spoke about all shades of gray. Debate allows that. When we don't have a debate, it's much easier to talk in black and white terms. But black and white terms do not bring solutions. What brings solution is, yes, informed, modest, humble discussion. And I would see one more merit to that debate. As when Federica Mogherini remembered a time at the fall of the Berlin Wall. I think many of us who remember, I think all of us who were adults at that time, remember that moment. But for my generation, an older generation, it was too much a retrospective memory. I think what we have now with the kind of debate that the Körber Foundation is organizing today is a possibility to build Europe not on its memories, but on shaping tomorrow's future. And that's what we need. And maybe some of the difficulties of European integration in the past 25 years have been that it was too much based on memory and not enough based on how we are going to shape together the common future. And so that's why I welcome that debate. I don't see it as vain at all.
Dankeschön. Ja, gucken wir nach vorne, Frau
So thank you. Let's look ahead. Mrs. Mogherini, you pinpointed it greatly. It's about complexity, to manage complexity within Europe. You've got 28 countries, 28 foreign ministers, 28 different interests, and I suppose 28 vanities as well. So I suppose if Mrs. Harman, for instance, wants to call Europe, is she going to call you?
Call I had on Saturday, November 1st, was from John Kerry. And the first thing I told him is, well, it's good already that... always remember Kissinger was complaining if I... for managing this complexity and external complexity. The European Union has developed a lot in the last decades. And if we want, the tools are there. We want. The problem can be the political will to fully use our potential, our common potential. It's true, we have a complexity of member states. I always say, having survived Italian politics, I think I will be fine with that. No, taking things seriously, point saying that in certain cases, I believe it will be the minority of cases, as I've seen that as a minister. We will have different interests. You know, when it comes to Europe,
your voice is heard.
Technology is not our best. It works? Yeah, good. It will be that in certain cases, I would say a minority of cases, some member states will have interests. No. No, but it goes... no. I shout? No.
Yeah. That works.
Sometimes it's not working. This one is working like this. Yeah. You know, Europe is also pragmatic solutions, I guess. That's flexibility somehow. I was saying we will need to find ways of either of compromising and staying together, or in some cases, and I know this might make someone nervous, but I think we have to move on to the future, also to find ways of agreeing a common majority position without hurting particular positions. And this would be, not maybe for my first 6 months, but maybe for the 5 years, at a certain stage, we might get to a point where we will take some discussions about that. But the main point to me, will be what Frank said. How do we manage to take advantage of national initiatives or of initiatives of groups of countries? The Weimar Triangle, the Visegrad, other formats are useful to me, are not a challenge to. We have to overcome this idea that national interest or initiatives are in competition with the European perspective and vice versa. Europe is its 28 member states, and the 28 member states have decided to come together to the European Union. It's not that they're forced to do it. It's a political decision. I'm sorry about that. It's a political decision. So we are on the same side. We are not Brussels and member states. And I think looking in that direction, taking advantage with this perspective of teamwork, we will have all to win.
Wir suchen nach einem common ground.
We are looking for a common ground, and this is what the Foreign Minister of Germany said. Let's talk about the Ukraine crisis and everything related to that. Did this strengthen the transatlantic partnership? Do you think that it's a strengthening element both for transatlantic and European partnerships?
Does this work?
Yeah.
Ah, okay. Well, I often say that if I were not an optimist, I would never have served in the United States Congress for 9 terms. And I am optimistic as I think about the partnership between the United States and Europe. And that partnership has been on display in Ukraine. It was very hard for Europe, harder than for the United States, to step up to tough sanctions because the impact on Europe is greater. Those sanctions are working and have been devastating to the Russian economy. The ruble is down 28% with the drop in oil prices. The economy of Russia is flat or negative. And yes, there are consequences to Europe, especially as it becomes colder this winter. But again, I think that those sanctions in place are deterring a substantial amount of Putin's conduct. So I see that as positive. I also see as positive the conversation in Europe about increasing its obligation to NATO. President Obama, as you all know, spoke in Latvia a few months ago and made clear that the United States is totally committed to NATO and will increase, if necessary, our military presence in those states surrounding Russia and Ukraine. I thought that was the right thing to do. He also challenged NATO states to step up, But I am respectful of the conversation going on here. I'm respectful of some who are also in the United States who think that increased military activity is not necessarily going to achieve a better result. But I think the conversation's healthy, and I think the result will be a strengthened NATO. And sort of a last point. It is true that in thinking about the threats against us, some of them from Mr. Putin in Russia, many of them from these terror groups in the Middle East, the way to achieve victory, maybe that's not a good word, the way to achieve some increased effectiveness is not the military way. We have to have, it seems to me, a narrative about what our societies stand for that will persuade people trying to decide whether to strap on suicide vests or join or rejoin civilized society, that the other choice, the civilized choice, is better. And there I see the U.S. and Europe very much in harmony. And as the leadership in Germany becomes, in my view, more muscular about Germany's role in foreign policy, I think that enhances the chance that the U.S.-European relationship will grow, and that the U.S., even those reluctant in the U.S., will have to step up as well.
Mrs. Harman, Sie haben gesagt, die Sanktionen.
Mrs. Harman, you said the sanctions are working. Mrs. Mogherini has said something different. She said these sanctions might not convince Mr. Putin to change his policy. That does not necessarily mean we don't need any sanctions. So we have a first difference between the European, because the German foreign minister also says the sanctions are right. Mrs. Mogherini, I'd like to give you a precise answer because we have a Twitter account here, and the visitors would like to have a clear-cut statement from you regarding the crisis and the sanctions. Are the sanctions effective?
This is one of the elements on which there is not a division, neither among Europeans nor on the transatlantic level. And one of the points of strength we have had in facing the crisis in Ukraine and the relation with Russia is our unity. This has been the best response. Our unity in itself has been the best response to a strategy that could have been aimed at divisions, either within Europe or between Europe and the United States. And I think that priority number one is keeping this unity in the future. On sanctions in particular, we agree on the fact that sanctions have worked. Russian economy has been affected very seriously about that. I understand that in one of the interviews that I've given to different newspapers, and giving interviews to different newspapers altogether, but you're a journalist yourself, you know that better than me, it might be that some newspapers have a different nuance to a different answer. It might be a language issue, it might be an interest, not a specific interest, I say an agenda interest for national perspectives. But I said the same thing to all the journalists there, and the thing was reported slightly different in different newspapers. What I say is that effectively, as they are on an economic level, and needed as they are, because it's the only tool of pressure that we can exercise on Russia if we say, as we say altogether, that there is no military solution to the crisis, so the only pressure that we can put on Russia is through sanctions. I said that we have to put together with sanctions in place a political strategy in order to have the pressure making some result on solving the crisis, because our aim is not putting sanctions. Our aim is putting pressure in order to solve the crisis. So together with the sanctions, I think that we have to do other two things. On one side, offering, as we have tried to do, and Germany has been crucial in doing that in the last months, together with the OSCE, offering a political track for an attempt to solve the crisis politically. And that's why it's so important that we ask and we continue to insist for the implementation, the full implementation of the Minsk Protocol. And on the other side, we have to put a third element to our strategy, that is full support to Ukraine, because the reforms in Ukraine, both on the political level, on the economic level, the issue of gas, are going to be crucial for the success of Ukraine itself and for the success of the choice of the Ukrainian people to look towards Europe. If Ukraine fails this winter or this transition, this is going to be the worst failure that we can have there, even far beyond the dramatic situation on the ground. This is at stake, showing that choosing the European perspective, a strong relation with the European Union, first, is not against anyone, and second, brings good things for the people of the country.
Und doch hat sich das
But still, the relationship during that crisis with Russia has deteriorated. The German-Russian, the European-Russian relationship has deteriorated. A lot of confidence is getting lost. Nobody believes anyone anymore. Well, Mr. Guéhenno, when we think about the future, what are we going to do with Russia in the future? Can we go on being as strict? I mean, Mr. Gorbachev has been warning that might be a way towards a new Cold War. Is it the right way forward, or do we have to build bridges and bring back Russia?
Well, first I would say that in the Security Council, while it's deeply divided over Syria, it's deeply divided over Ukraine, Russia has been working with the Western members of the Security Council on a number of issues. So the relationship is not completely broken. We see on Iran, for instance, that Russia is working with the E3, and that's very important. Long term, I think we have to be honest. There is the manipulation of a sense of humiliation of having lost a war that is being used at the moment in Moscow, and it's very important to get over that. I mean, the long-term best interest of Russia and of Europe is to have a cooperative relationship. Both parties will just be weakened if they enter into a cycle of increased confrontation, and the rest of the world will move on. So it would just accelerate a relative decline of Europe vis-à-vis the rest of the world. So there's a very strong interest, I think, of the Europeans and of Moscow, if they think it through, in getting over that crisis. Fundamental principles of international law have been broken. So we cannot ignore that. And that's why the sanctions, they may not make things better, but their absence would make things significantly worse, because it would signal a weakness that is dangerous. But Ukraine, it is for the moment an area of confrontation between Russia and Europe. Frankly, it will be very hard for the Europeans to help Ukraine if it is in confrontation with Russia. There may be, at the moment, calculation that an unstable, weak Ukraine is what some might want in Moscow. Long term, it's bad for Russia too, because sometimes, let's say, the criminal elements that exist in some parts of Ukraine, they will also impact on Russia. It's not as if you can have a weak country on your border and be completely safe on your side. So there is a real joint interest of the Europeans and of Russia in working together to transform Ukraine. At the moment, this sounds completely unrealistic because we are in the middle of the confrontation. But we have to keep that door open, because if that door is not open, we'll all suffer. The Europeans, Russia, and of course Ukraine in the first place.
Dann darf ich die Frage.
May I pass on this question to Mr. Steinmeier as well? Recently, a lot was being said. There were lies on all sides. How can we regain confidence? How can we instill confidence in all partners, and how can we find our way back towards a partnership without feeling permanently disappointed about the promises that were not kept? Think about Minsk.
Vor dem Gefühl von Enttäuschung nicht.
I mean, we cannot be protected against the feeling of disappointment. You just get disappointed sometimes, but you have to be professional in spite of disappointment. So no matter whether we decide for sanctions or not, we know at the end of the day that there's hardly anything else that we can do. We have used our possibilities in recent months in order to contribute to a de-escalation of the situation. In particular, now, if the reports are right that we have heard in the last 2 days, we see a relapse and an increase of the military confrontation. But let me start from the beginning once again. As far as the sanctions are concerned, I think you have to see those sanctions both from an economic and a political perspective. Economically speaking, the Russian economic figures were closely observed by us, and we've seen that the economic damage has happened because in a very early phase, before we even decided to impose sanctions, we have seen immense flights of capital out of Russia and a lack of foreign direct investment into Russia. Then we've seen a decline of the ruble. Some interventions have taken place against that from the Russian side, but we've seen a permanently low oil price. 4 different effects which had an economic consequence. The consequences of that were probably cumulatively more drastic than the sanctions, the consequences of the sanctions we have decided in Europe and the US. Now, let's look at the political level. What does it mean to impose sanctions? Here, Mrs. Mogherini has raised some doubts which have been misinterpreted. She has said we cannot be sure that the additional sanctions we have decided will bring Putin back to rational behavior. At the moment, obviously, the Kremlin is far from having a rational behavior. What does that mean for the future? I think for the future, we have to be realistic and not just decide foreign policy issues from the perspective of sanctions. A foreign policy can only be successful if it is in a position to overcome, first to diffuse and then to overcome a conflict. That also means, if we are realistic, we have to have a timeline. Mrs. Meier, I told some of your colleagues, and they were shocked when I said it, I told them it takes 2 weeks to start a conflict, but it takes 14 years to resolve such a conflict. And that is why I'd like to say right at the beginning that we are going to be involved in trying to prevent a further escalation of the situation in the Ukraine. We are going to employ all resources we have. And in such an exaggerated situation, we also need to be involved in talks. The desire to cut talks, conversations, and channels of communication, that is something I don't understand. It's really not understandable why people want to cut certain channels of communication. Look at the experience we have had in different perspectives of foreign policy. At the end of the day, the only thing we can do is keep up the pressure, but also look for ways and means to talk, to negotiate, in order to at least de-escalate the situation. If anybody else has a third option, a third idea, please tell us so. We'd like to follow. But for me, the only possibility I see is to go for communication. And that means, as you've said, yes, there is a lack of confidence, and we have to work in spite of this confidence lost. But when we say we have no more confidence, that cannot mean we stop working together. Since you said that, somebody said something about Iran already. How about Iran? Are there any negotiations? And also a question we've received via Twitter. If we get a result with Russia, that might be to the detriment of Ukraine. Do you see any likelihood we can make progress there? A couple of weeks ago, in my speech at the United Nations, I said there are many reasons to solve the Ukraine conflict. One reason is that people are dying there. Secondly, the Ukraine at the moment is a country torn apart. Many reasons to solve the crisis there. And one very important reason is why we should solve the crisis is this resurgence of the East-West conflict. And at the moment, because of that resurgence, we have a blockade in the UN Security Council. So as long as we don't solve the crisis in the Ukraine, resolutions and decisions in the UN Security Council cannot be taken with the support of all 5 veto powers. And so for regional European perspectives, we have a good reason to try and get over the conflict. But there's also this greater context, namely the functioning of the United Nations, which is so important in the light of all the crises we see. And therefore, I hope very much we will find a solution and will get a successful negotiation with Iran so that in the future Iran will not be in a position to get access to nuclear weapons. And secondly, I hope we will find a solution regarding the number of centrifuges, the capacity of the centrifuges, the breakout time. Well, as far as the content is concerned, we have found a certain level of common understanding. So I hope that the 24th of November will not be a day of disappointment. If we get a success, you're right, then we might have a basis for other crises. On the basis of that success, we might also be more courageous to engage in cooperation in order to solve other conflicts. Do you share this optimism, Mrs. Harman?
I wanted to say that some journalists writing about Iran and Ukraine see it as a zero-sum game. If Russia helps on Iran, and at least reports indicate that Russia is helping, that means that we will wink at Russia's activities in Ukraine. And I don't see why this has to be a zero-sum game. I think it could easily be a positive-sum game. And I agree with Herr Steinmeier that if Russia plays a positive role in Iran, that can start a better conversation about Russia playing a positive role in Ukraine and playing a positive role in the UN Security Council. I had a conversation fairly recently with John Kerry, whom I admire greatly, about diplomacy and about the fact that in so many of these crises, the same players are in the room. And I said, how does he see this? And his answer was that it's a dance, and that in some cases you dance with these partners, and in other cases you dance with those partners, but it keeps on going. And again, the optimist view of this, that would be me, is that it can keep on going and get to a positive outcome across these many crises. It's a complex world. This is very hard to figure out, but it is at least reassuring to me to see on the television this morning that there's President Xi walking in China, and President Putin's on one side and President Obama's on the other side, and they're not smiling, but they're physically in the same room. I think that is an opportunity.
Ja, wir kommen zur Schlussrunde.
Okay, final round of discussion, and I would like to ask all of our panelists briefly to tell us what do you see is the greatest problem, the greatest challenge for the near future? Mr. Guéhenno, do you already know what the most pertinent challenge is for the near future, and in how far German foreign policy will be important?
I think the challenge is that in the Cold War, there was one overarching issue, and so you could summarize the world with that issue. Today, there are a number of competing issues. There are the overall challenge to the international legal order that has been posed by the crisis in Ukraine, and that's a fundamental issue that goes way beyond Europe because it reverberates throughout the world. And so it should be at the top of the list, and it is at the top of the list. There is the issue of proliferation that I just discussed with Iran. But I think there's also an issue that we haven't discussed much this morning, which is the whole question of weakly governed states or the loss of control over vast areas of the planet by states. The states, they are the first line of defense of an international order. And if the states can't deliver that order, then we are in trouble. And that's what we see actually in vast parts of Syria with the Islamic State developing in that vacuum. That's what we see in the Sahel. These are real strategic challenges in the long run, and we need to address them.
Frau Mogherini?
I think the main challenge that could be the overarching issue of our times is that we, Europeans, but also Americans, get the narrative of these times right. Because what Frank was referring to, the risk of the temptation of cutting the dialogue lines is the most dangerous thing we can do, either with the Muslim world, either with Russia, either with other partners or non-partners that could come up in the near future. If we switch to the confrontational attitude and narrative, rather than engaging and asking our partners to stay engaged in a cooperational mode, I think this is the main challenge we have. To keep calm, try to remember that we are the side that is asking engagement for cooperation, wherever conflicts and crises are. And that is the only way to try and solve them pragmatically. It's actually not easy. It has never been easy. But this shadowed, complex world, which is not only shadows of gray, but also of different colors, I think requires from us to keep focused on this added value of trying to find what we say the political solution, which is something that I guess out of there, people ask sometimes, what does it mean? It means that you find an added value in keeping the dialogue open and share possible solution in the interests of everybody.
Herr Steinmeier, wollen Sie weitermachen?
Mr. Steinmeier, would you like to continue? Well, I don't want to touch upon any concrete conflict. I remember a word James Baker recently mentioned when he was here, together with Henry Kissinger, in a small round which we sat together in, and he said realism should not be a dirty word in foreign policy. So, in other words, this is not saying that we should have just a blunt realpolitik, but rather it is a hint at saying we have to be clear on where we're missing out on opportunities. Just take the Syria conflict, for instance, because I saw it myself, I experienced it myself. So in 2006, I think, when I was there the first time, and I had the impression that Syria, being made out to be part of the axis of the evil, is a risk, because one of the secular governed countries in the region may be lost that way. But in that situation, there was no discussion possible whether one should not take another political attempt with Syria. That was with France, Mr. Guéhenno, as you know, it was difficult. It was difficult with the United States. Second missed chance was the first Syria conference in Geneva. So in the first or second week of my second period in office, I think it was December, January 2013 and 2014, at a Syrian conference, I saw this, like everyone around the table represented the position that Assad is not there anymore. But we, amongst ourselves, were looking for a solution which assumed Assad weren't there anymore. But, so I'm just saying that maybe it's not the greatest risk, but it would be clever for a joint a common European or transatlantic foreign policy, it would be wise to understand early enough where existing chances might be missed. Mrs. Harman. So, patient foreign policy, what do you think? So what's the biggest challenge for foreign policy?
I think our biggest challenge is to be strategic. Too often, again, focusing on the U.S. situation, we're tactical. And we have an immediate problem and we respond to that problem, but we don't see it as part of a bigger world that is complex. I was listening to Henry Kissinger for 5 hours at Harvard a few days ago, which is a lot of Henry Kissinger, but he is still enormously active and brilliant at age 91 and a half. And he kept talking about how each problem links to other problems and how at least he, when he was in his major security roles, tried to see the world that way. And I think we risk a lot if we don't see the world that way. And it is an enormous challenge for the U.S. government because our Congress is so toxically partisan, and one side says yes, and the other side reflexively says no. And our president is very cautious. And so this is a hard challenge for us. But I'm very excited about new leadership at the EU. And I'm excited about this word of strategic partnership. If we can develop this strategic partnership with the U.S. as a major partner, and we can do this together, I think that that is our biggest foreign policy challenge, and I think we have a way to work it out.
Dankeschön, Jane Harman. Ja, wir müssen zum Ende kommen.
So we have to round up. So there was a lot of nodding and confirmations. So we hope that this strategy will be discussed together. Thank you very much for taking so much time to bring forward your position. Thank you all to the panel. So I would like to thank the panelists as well for their contributions. So we heard from Mrs. Mogherini that Europe should be above national interest. Mrs. Mogherini would like to wish you a lot of success, a lot of strength in the challenges, in tackling the challenges we discussed. And I believe that together, we believe that the transatlantic partnership is an important part of our strategic work. And we wish that our politicians will be successful in what they have to take, the decisions they have to take. And we wish that the people that elect you and the people that monitor your work will have the same impression that what you do in most cases will be the right thing. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We'll come back for 11 after the coffee break.